There are stories in Hollywood that shine brightly for a moment and then fade into the background. And then there are stories like that of Maggie Gyllenhaal. Stories that don't just shine but quietly transform everything around them. Stories that whisper instead of shout, yet somehow echo louder than the noise of fame itself. Because Maggie's journey is not just about becoming famous, it's about becoming real in a world that constantly tries to turn people into something artificial. And if you look closely at her life, you'll realize that her success was never about chasing the spotlight, but about standing in her truth even when it felt uncomfortable, even when it felt risky, even when it meant being misunderstood. And that is exactly what makes her story so powerful. Because from the very beginning, she was surrounded by cinema, born into a family deeply rooted in storytelling, with her father, Stephen Gyllenhaal, being a director, and her brother Jake Gyllenhaal rising as one of the most respected actors of his generation. But instead of letting that environment define her, Maggie chose to carve her own identity, slowly, patiently, refusing to be just another name attached to a famous family, because deep inside, she understood something that many people spend their entire lives trying to figure out: that true success isn't about how loudly the world applauds you, but about how honestly you can live with yourself. And that belief shaped every decision she made, every role she chose, every step she took into an industry that often rewards conformity more than courage. And yet Maggie stood apart, not by trying to be different for the sake of attention, but by embracing roles that were raw, complex, and unapologetically human, roles that reflected the kind of depth that most mainstream cinema tends to avoid. And this is where her journey becomes more than just a career timeline. It becomes a lesson in authenticity, because when she started gaining attention with films like Secretary, she didn't choose the safe route. She chose a role that challenged societal norms, a role that could have easily been misunderstood or criticized, but instead of playing it safe, she leaned into the discomfort, and in doing so, she didn't just prove her talent, she proved her fearlessness. And that moment became a turning point, not just in her career, but in the way audiences began to see her, not as someone trying to fit into Hollywood's expectations, but as someone quietly reshaping them. And this pattern continued as she moved forward, taking on roles that demanded emotional honesty, roles that required vulnerability, roles that asked her to explore the messy, complicated sides of being human. And that's something many actors avoid because it doesn't always guarantee applause. But Maggie understood that real connection comes from truth, not perfection. And that's why when she stepped into the role of Rachel Dawes in The Dark Knight, she didn't just play a character in a blockbuster. She brought a grounded humanity into a world filled with chaos and spectacle, reminding audiences that even in the biggest stories, it's the quiet emotional moments that leave the deepest impact. And yet, even after being part of one of the most successful films of all time, she didn't let that define her path. She didn't chase bigger explosions or louder roles. Instead, she continued to choose stories that mattered, stories that said something, stories that reflected her values. And that is where her journey starts to reveal something truly inspiring. Because in a world that constantly pushes people to do more, be more, achieve more, Maggie chose to go deeper instead of louder. And that decision is what set her apart. Because depth requires courage, it requires patience, it requires a willingness to be seen, not as perfect, but as real. And over time, that authenticity began to resonate more and more, not just with audiences, but with critics, with filmmakers, with anyone who values storytelling that speaks to the human experience. And as the years passed, Maggie didn't just grow as an actress. She evolved as an artist, someone who wasn't afraid to question the industry itself, someone who spoke openly about the challenges women face in Hollywood, about the limitations placed on them, about the need for change. And instead of just talking about it, she decided to become part of that change. And that decision led her to step behind the camera, to take on the role of a director with The Lost Daughter, a film that once again reflected her commitment to telling honest, complex, and deeply human stories. And in doing so, she proved that her journey was never just about acting. It was about storytelling in its purest form, storytelling that challenges, that questions, that connects. And that is what makes her story so powerful, because it reminds us that success is not a destination, but a process a continuous journey of growth, of self-discovery, of staying true to who you are, even when the world tries to shape you into something else. And as you follow Maggie Gyllenhaal's path, you begin to realize that her greatest achievement is not the awards she has won or the roles she has played, but the way she has remained authentic in an industry that often rewards imitation, the way she has chosen courage over comfort, depth over surface, truth over perfection. And that is a lesson that goes far beyond Hollywood, a lesson that applies to anyone who has ever felt the pressure to fit in, to follow the expected path, to silence their true voice. Because Maggie's story shows that there is another way, a way that may not always be easy, a way that may not always be understood, but a way that leads to something far more meaningful, something real, something lasting. And as her journey continues, it becomes clear that this is only the beginning of a story that will continue to inspire, to challenge, and to remind us all that true success is not about becoming what the world expects, but about becoming who you truly are, Dad. And as Maggie Gyllenhaal's journey continued to unfold, something even more powerful began to take shape. Something that separated her not just from other actors, but from the entire system that often defines success in rigid and predictable ways. Because what she started to build was not just a career, but a legacy rooted in intention. And that intention was clear in every choice she made, in every role she accepted, in every opportunity she turned down. Because unlike many who chase visibility at any cost, Maggie understood that every yes comes with a responsibility, and every no is an act of self-respect. And this mindset quietly became her greatest strength, allowing her to navigate an industry that can easily overwhelm even the most talented individuals. Because Hollywood is not just about talent, it's about endurance. It's about staying grounded when everything around you is designed to pull you in different directions. And Maggie managed to do that by staying deeply connected to her values, refusing to compromise her voice for temporary success. And this is where her story becomes deeply inspiring, because it's not just about what she achieved, it's about how she achieved it, with patience, with integrity, and with a sense of purpose that never faded, even when the path became uncertain. And as time went on, she began to take on roles that explored the complexities of womanhood in ways that were rarely seen on screen, portraying characters that were not defined by perfection, but by contradiction, by vulnerability, by strength that doesn't always look strong. And this ability to embrace imperfection became one of her defining qualities, because in a world that constantly pushes unrealistic ideals, Maggie chose to reflect reality, to show that beauty lies in authenticity, that power lies in truth. And that impact comes from honesty, not from pretending to be something you're not. And this philosophy didn't just influence her acting, it shaped her entire perspective as an artist, leading her to question the narratives that dominate mainstream cinema, leading her to ask deeper questions about representation, about whose stories are being told and whose voices are being heard. And instead of waiting for those answers to come from others, she decided to create them herself, stepping into the role of a filmmaker with a vision that was both bold and deeply personal. And when she brought The Lost Daughter to life, it wasn't just a film, it was a statement, a reflection of her belief that stories about women deserve complexity, deserve nuance, deserve to exist beyond stereotypes. And the way she approached that project revealed something remarkable: a willingness to take risks, to explore uncomfortable truths, to trust her instincts even when they went against conventional expectations. And that is where true leadership begins, not in controlling outcomes, but in having the courage to follow your vision even when the path is unclear. And as her work as a director gained recognition, it became evident that Maggie was no longer just part of the industry. She was shaping it, influencing the way stories are told, inspiring others to embrace authenticity in their own work. And this evolution from actor to filmmaker represents more than just a career milestone. It represents a shift in identity, a transformation from someone who interprets stories to someone who creates them. And that transformation is not easy. It requires stepping into the unknown. It requires letting go of the safety that comes with familiarity. And yet Maggie embraced it with the same quiet confidence that has defined her journey from the beginning. And as she continued to grow, her voice became stronger, her perspective clearer, and her impact deeper, not just through her work, but through the way she carries herself.